This is Ndtv, and you're watching Classics.
Hello and welcome to Reality Bites, the program that takes you all across India and the subcontinent. On this episode, the politics of hunger and starvation. As Orissa's tragedy continues to unfold day after day, the Supreme Court has responded strongly to a public interest petition that demands the right to food for all Indian citizens. Media attention is fixed on Orissa at this point, but in every corner of the country, hunger is pushing people to the very edge of starvation. On this episode, Reality Bites travels to Rajasthan. And as we discover, the right to food can only have real meaning if we change the way we define hunger and starvation. Driving through the southernmost belt of Rajasthan, it is easy to mistake the rich stretches of greenery for a sign of well-being. Nothing, though, could be further from the truth. This is one of the poorest, most backward tribal belts in India. On the margins of national imagination, endless reports of death and starvation push it to center stage. Just 4 months ago, drought choked life here. And although government logs will never acknowledge it, starvation pushed 4 people to death. Today too, hunger and death lurk just beneath the surface. We're traveling with volunteers from a local NGO when our journey is suddenly interrupted. Someone has found out that 11 little children have died in a remote interior village. Our car bumps along the narrow, dusty track till it hits the last motorable point in the village of Mewar Kamar. For the past week, 1 child has died here every single day of an undiagnosed fever. But this team of government doctors is making its first visit only today. That too because the NGO dragged them here in its own jeep. And the news is much worse than anyone thought. At least 100 children are ill, many critically. The village's population is scattered across an expanse of steep hills, and to understand the full magnitude of the tragedy here, we decide to trek up to the homes on the hilltops. So remote, no doctor or government official has ever bothered to make the journey. The nearest home is a good 5 kilometers away, and on these steep slopes, that means at least 2 hours on foot. For miles, we see nothing and no one. And then suddenly the distant sound of women crying breaks the silence. A few yards ahead, we see a man marching quietly through the grass. In his arms is a young child, his 5-year-old son, now dead. Janaram has walked 20 kilometers today. In the morning, he carried his fever-ridden son, Kesar, down to the local hospital. Kesar died on the way. His father then walked right back up the same hills to bury his dead child. As a small group of men help Janaram, grief mingles with anger. The same story has returned to haunt. No household has enough food to feed its children and help them fight an ordinary fever. In this part of the world, a viral fever can become life-threatening, all because there is virtually no food. On a good day, a meal here is made up of what the tribals call rabri, a mixture of ground maize which is thinned with water so that it lasts longer. And as Janaram tells us, hardly the food for a sick child. आपको नहीं लगा कि बच्चे को कोशिश करें कुछ और खिलाने की?
कोशिश तो खूब करा, खूब हाव गणो खिलावा पण पिया में खिलावा रुपया तो वेने की मकना रुपया।
पैसा नहीं था।
पैसा
क्या खिलाया? मक्की?
मैकी की राबड़ी और
मक्की की राबड़ी को छोड़ के गेहूं था आपके पास?
नहीं था।
गेहूं की रोटी थी, दही था, सब्जी थी कोई?
सब्जी तो बनाता दी कोई जी पानी थोड़ा मिले मैं किलो आटो में नौके कड़ी बनावा।
अच्छा, मक्की और पानी की करी बनाई आपने। In fact, it's not unusual for desperate villagers to fall back on leaves that grow in the wild as a necessary substitute for regular food. मक्की के अलावा कुछ खाने को मिलता है?
दूसरा तो कुछ भी नहीं है ना, गेहूं है तो कहाँ मिलता है गेहूं?
लखराम जी आप बताएं।
हम तो मैगी खाता है, पुआरा की सब्जी बनावे खाता है।
पुआरा क्या होता है, दिखाएं हमें।
यो जारी
हाँ, ये पत्ता
ये पत्ता बाफे न पैसे खाते।
इसकी क्या खाते हैं आप?
यो पानी में बाप करके थोड़ा बहुत मिर्चा डाल के पेशन है थी वो नसो भी करे न पेशन वापस खाया जाता है। यो ऐप भी खाता है,
ये से खाता है।
मैं हमेशा खाता हूँ।
आप खाते हैं इसको? इससे इसकी क्या बनती है सब्जी? इससे कुछ नुकसान तो नहीं होता सेहत को?
अब भाई मरता क्या करो,
मरा दे खाऊ
भूखा मरता तो मरे, खाना पड़ता है।
And here's the moot question. The government would like to argue that these families are not really haunted by hunger. But here's a diet that depends almost exclusively on small quantities of watery maize and wild leaves. Here are homes where one roti is split between 6 children. Can this really support life? Imagine if you were Janaram, walking through these steep and difficult hilly slopes, carrying your dead child in your arms for more than 20 kilometers. This is the 11th child to have died in this village in the past 10 days. It's difficult to say what the exact and immediate cause of these deaths has been. But one thing is certain, the children who have died and the scores of children who are still ill have all suffered from malnourishment. The parents of these children have told us and shown us that they have nothing to feed their children or themselves except some form of maize. This raises a larger question over what exactly is the dividing line between starvation and malnutrition.
हाँ बिल्कुल है। भूख और बीमारी में कनेक्शन के लिए मैं आपको बता सकता हूँ कि ये जो जितनी मौतें हुई है ये कुपोषण के कारण हुई है। तो कुपोषण के पीछे ये भूख का कारण ही रहा है, क्योंकि लोगों के घर में खाने के लिए मक्की के सिवा कोई अनाज नहीं, और मक्की भी पूरी तरह से नहीं है, जैसा कि अपन ने देखा है घर पे जाके। और उस मक्की के और ये पुबाड़िया जो पौधा होता है उसके पानी वो खुद भी पीते हैं लोग और बच्चों को भी पिलाते हैं, और वो बच्चों को जो न्यूट्रिशन मिलना चाहिए वो उन बच्चों को नहीं मिल पाता है, और सिर्फ एक ही चीज़ खाने के कारण वो कुपोषित है, और कुपोषण के कारण ही उनकी डेथ हो रही है ज़्यादातर।
Ironically, the government has in its own reports admitted that the absence of proper food can be a killer disease. In 1997, a report of the Ministry of Tribal Affairs found that in remote and backward areas, the months of May to September are the most critical as far as deaths due to malnutrition combined with infection are concerned. It promised to set up grain banks, since to combat the situation, it is necessary that there is an uninterrupted food supply to poor tribal families. 4 years later, Rajasthan's tribals are still waiting. Meanwhile, more than half of India's children continue to be undernourished. That's worse even than the record of sub-Saharan and African countries.